You're staying here. It's just easier this way." Those were the last words my mother said to me before she climbed into a silver SUV, pulling the door shut on my 10-year-old life. Through the glass, I saw my brother, Leo. He didn't look back. He was holding a brand-new handheld gaming console, his face illuminated by the screen, already living in a world where I didn't exist. A few minutes later, my father's truck engine turned over. My sister Clara was in the passenger seat, surrounded by designer shopping bags. She didn't look back either. She was too busy checking her reflection in the sun visor mirror, adjusting a silk headband. And then, there was me, standing on a gravel driveway with a single moth-eaten suitcase and a heavy heart, watching two sets of taillights fade into the distance in opposite directions. My parents were getting a conscious uncoupling, as they called it. But to me, it felt like a surgical extraction. They had divided the assets, the properties, and the children. Leo was the golden boy, the athlete, the one my mother could parade around her country club friends. Clara was the beauty, the socialite in training, the perfect accessory for my father's new bachelor lifestyle in the city. And I was the difficult one, the one with the messy hair, the quiet voice, and the grades that weren't quite high enough to brag about, but not low enough to warrant special attention. Yes, I was the leftover, the item they forgot to list in the divorce settlement until the very last minute. "She can stay with your mother," my dad had said during the final blowout. "I don't have the space in the new condo." "And you know she gets under Leo's skin," my mom had snapped back. "Why can't she go with you? I'm working 60 hours a week. I can't be a single parent to a girl." They had argued about me like I was a piece of furniture that didn't fit the new aesthetic. Finally, they reached a compromise that involved a tiny, drafty house at the end of a dirt road, 3 hours away from anything they considered civilization. I felt a wrinkled, calloused hand drop onto my shoulder. "Let them go, little bird," my Grandma Rose whispered. Her voice was like dry leaves skittering across pavement, thin but surprisingly strong. "The wind blows the chaff away so the grain can grow. Let them go." I looked up at her. Grandma Rose was a woman the rest of the family whispered about. They called her eccentric. They called her difficult. My mother used to laugh about the old shack Rose lived in, promising she'd never set foot there again. That day, as I watched the dust settle on the empty road, I realized I was nothing to them. I was a burden they had finally managed to put down. My parents took my brother, my dad took my sister, and I was left with a woman they all looked down on. They thought I was nothing. They thought they were leaving me in a graveyard of a life, surrounded by old books and garden dirt. What they didn't know was that Grandma Rose wasn't just an eccentric old woman, and that shack wasn't a prison, it was a school. For the next 10 years, I stayed quiet. I didn't call. I didn't beg for them to take me back. When they sent the occasional birthday card with a $20 bill tucked inside, pity money, I handed it straight to Grandma. "Knowledge is the only thing they can't take from you," she told me one night as we sat by the fireplace. She wasn't teaching me math or history. She was teaching me how to read people, how to see the cracks in a person's armor, how to wait for the right moment to strike. She taught me about the old money secrets she had kept hidden, the investments my father never knew about, and the legal loopholes my mother was too shallow to understand. "They think they won the divorce," Grandma said, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "But they've spent their lives building houses out of toothpicks. One day, little bird, you're going to be the storm." I stayed quiet. And that scared them more than any screaming match ever could. Because while they were out living their loud, flashy lives, I was becoming someone they wouldn't recognize. But then, the letter arrived. After 12 years of silence, a thick, cream-colored envelope landed on Grandma's porch. It was an invitation. My sister Clara was getting married to a billionaire's son. A merger of dynasties, the papers were calling it. They wanted me there. Not because they missed me, not because they loved me. They wanted me there because the groom's family valued traditional family unity, and it would look bad if the lost sister wasn't in the wedding photos. They thought they could just summon me back like a dog that had been left in the rain. They thought I'd be grateful for the invite. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I looked at Grandma Rose. She was smiling, a slow, predatory smile that made my blood run cold and hot all at once. "Go," she said. "Show them what the leftover looks like now." I opened the envelope and felt a strange sensation. For years, I had been the girl they forgot. But as I read the names on that expensive card, I realized the truth. This wasn't a wedding invitation. It was an opening. Before we go any further into how I prepared for that wedding and the secret Grandma Rose revealed to me that night, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been the underdog in your family? The one everyone underestimated? If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the moment I face them again. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I love seeing how far our little community reaches. The invitation sat on the scarred wooden kitchen table like a venomous snake. Clara's name was embossed in shimmering gold foil, looping and arrogant. Below it, my parents' names were listed together as hosts, as if the last decade of bitterness and court battles had been nothing but a minor misunderstanding. "They sent a dress," Grandma Rose said, gesturing toward a large box that had arrived with the courier. I opened it. Inside was a gown the color of dishwater, a muted, muddy beige. It was high-collared, shapeless, and clearly designed to make me blend into the background of the wedding photos. It was a pity dress. It said, "Look at our poor, plain cousin from the country. Isn't it kind of us to include her?" What they didn't know was that I hadn't spent the last 12 years just pulling weeds in a garden. Under Grandma Rose's tutelage, I had become a ghost in the digital world. While Leo was failing out of expensive private schools and Clara was busy being a brand ambassador for products she didn't use, I was finishing my degree online by age 19. By 21, I was managing a private hedge fund that Grandma had started with the dust of her inheritance, money my father assumed was long gone. "You look at that dress and you see an insult," Grandma said, sipping her tea. "I look at it and see a camouflage. They want you to be invisible? Fine. Be the air they breathe. They won't notice you're there until they're gasping for oxygen." I spent the weeks leading up to the wedding doing two things: exercising until my body was lean and hard as a diamond, and digging. I didn't dig in the dirt this time. I dug into my father's flourishing real estate empire. I dug into my mother's charitable foundations, and what I found made my skin crawl. My father wasn't a titan of industry. He was a house of cards. He had been borrowing from one high-interest lender to pay off the last, using Clara's upcoming marriage as collateral. He had promised the groom's family a dowry, a share in a company that, on paper, was worth millions. In reality, it was a hollow shell. And my mother? Her foundations were a revolving door for offshore accounts. They weren't just getting a divorce back then, they were splitting the loot. And they had left me behind because a third child was a third mouth to feed, a third college fund to fake, and a third set of eyes that might see the truth. That's when everything changed. I realized I wasn't just the girl who was left behind. I was the witness they thought they'd silenced. The night before I left for the city, Grandma Rose took me to the basement. Behind a stack of old preserves was a small, heavy safe. She didn't use a key. She used a fingerprint. "Your grandfather knew what your father was," she whispered. "He knew that man would burn through every cent to keep up appearances. So he left a fail-safe, not for his son, for the one who stayed." She pulled out a leather-bound folder. Inside were the original deeds to the family's ancestral estate. The very land my father's new luxury development was currently being built on. "He forged my signature to start the construction," Grandma said calmly. "He thinks I'm too senile to notice. He thinks I'll just die in this shack and the problem will go away." I looked at the documents. My father had built a multi-million-dollar project on land he didn't legally own. He had sold condos to the elite of the city, including the groom's family, on a foundation of fraud. I stayed quiet, and that scared them more. I didn't call the police. I didn't call a lawyer. Not yet. I packed the beige pity dress into my suitcase, but tucked the leather folder underneath it. When I pulled up to the 5-star hotel where the pre-wedding gala was being held, I didn't arrive in a limo. I took a dusty local bus and walked the last 3 blocks, carrying my own suitcase. I wanted them to see exactly what they expected to see. I walked through the gilded lobby, feeling the eyes of the staff on my worn boots and faded denim jacket. When I reached the check-in desk, the clerk looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Deliveries are in the back," he said. "I'm here for the wedding," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm the sister of the bride." The clerk froze, his eyes darting to the list. "Oh, miss, yes, you're in the service wing, room 412. They hadn't even put me on the same floor as the family. I was tucked away near the elevators and the linen closets. I entered the small, cramped room and sat on the edge of the bed. The door opened 10 minutes later. My mother walked in, smelling of expensive perfume and gin. She didn't hug me. She didn't even look me in the eye. She just scanned the room and sighed. "You look healthy," she said, the word sounding like an insult. "The dress we sent, make sure you steam it, and for heaven's sake do something with your hair. We told the groom's family you've been recovering from a long illness in the country. Don't embarrass us by talking too much." "I won't say a word, Mother," I replied. She nodded, satisfied. "Good. Your father is busy with the investors. Leo is enjoying the open bar. Try to stay out of the way until the photos tomorrow." She turned to leave, but then she paused. "And don't mention your grandmother. People in this circle don't need to hear about her situation." But as the door clicked shut, I pulled out my laptop. I didn't need their luxury suite. I had something better. I had the login credentials to the hotel's internal server, which I'd spent the last 3 hours bypassing. I looked at the guest list for the private investor dinner happening tonight in the ballroom. My father's future depended on the men in that room. He was about to sign the final papers to hand over the development to the groom's father. I looked at my reflection in the small, cracked mirror above the desk. I wasn't the 10-year-old girl on the gravel driveway anymore. I was the storm. I didn't put on the beige dress. Instead, I pulled out a sleek, midnight black silk slip dress I'd hidden in the lining of my suitcase, a gift from Grandma Rose. I stood in the center of that cramped, dim room, staring at the black silk hanging from my frame. It wasn't just a dress. It was a second skin. Grandma Rose had told me that the best way to destroy a lion was to walk into its den looking like a hunter, not a meal. I did my own makeup. I didn't want the soft, blushing look of a bridesmaid. I wanted sharp lines, eyes that looked like they could cut through the thickest lies, and lips the color of a bruised heart. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the leftover child anymore. I saw a woman they had spent 12 years trying to erase and failing. The ballroom was a sea of white lilies and champagne towers. The air was thick with the smell of old money and desperation, mostly my father's. I stood at the entrance, partially obscured by a marble pillar. Across the room, I saw them. My family. My father was laughing too loudly, slapping the shoulder of a man in a bespoke suit, the groom's father, a man known for his ruthless business tactics. My mother was flitting between groups, her smile as fixed and frozen as the diamonds around her neck. And then there was Clara. She looked beautiful, I'll give her that. But it was a fragile beauty, built on the assumption that the world would always bow to her. They thought I was tucked away in the service wing, probably crying into a pillow. I waited for the exact moment the room went quiet for the first toast. My father stepped up to the microphone, a crystal glass in his hand. He looked triumphant. This was the night he would finally secure the funding to bury his debts forever. "I want to thank you all for being here," he started, his voice booming. "Tonight is about family, about unity, and about the bright future we are building, literally, with the Rosewood Development Project." I didn't wait for him to finish. I stepped out from behind the pillar and walked straight down the center of the room. The click of my heels on the marble was like a gunshot in the silence. One by one, heads began to turn. At first it was just curiosity. Who was the woman in the black dress who looked like she owned the air she breathed? But as I got closer to the head table, I saw the color drain from my mother's face. Her glass tilted, a splash of expensive vintage staining her white silk gown. My father's voice faltered. He stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. I stayed quiet, and that scared them more. I didn't stop until I was standing right in front of the microphone. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked directly at my father. "You forgot to introduce the guest of honor, Dad," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in that silent room it carried to every corner. It was a whisper that felt like a scream. Who is this?" the groom's father asked, his brow furrowing as he looked between me and my father. She's been unwell," my mother stammered, rushing forward to grab my arm. Her grip was like a vice, her nails digging into my skin. "Darling, you should be in bed. The medication—" I gently but firmly peeled her hand off me. I turned to the groom's father and smiled. It was the smile of a predator. "I'm the sister of the bride," I said, "the one they left at the end of a dirt road 12 years ago. But I'm not here to talk about the past. I'm here to talk about the Rosewood development you're about to invest $50 million into." My father's face went from pale to a deep, dangerous purple. "Get her out of here! Security!" This is where they made their biggest mistake. They thought calling security would silence me. But the groom's father was a man of business, and his scent for trouble was tingling. He raised a hand, stopping the approaching guards. "Wait," he said, his eyes narrowing. "What about the development?" I pulled a small, high-capacity flash drive from my clutch. "The land that project is built on? It doesn't belong to my father. It belongs to my grandmother, Rose, and she never signed the release forms. Those signatures on your contracts, they're as fake as my mother's smile." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Clara let out a small, sharp cry of, "Dad, what is she talking about?" My father lunged for the microphone, but I stepped back, out of his reach. I looked at the room full of the city's most powerful people, the people my parents had spent their entire lives trying to impress. "My father is a fraud," I said clearly. "My mother is an accomplice. And this wedding, it's not a union. It's a bailout." What they didn't know was that this was only the beginning of the night. I saw the groom's father look at the flash drive in my hand, then at my father's sweating, trembling face. The merger of dynasties was crumbling in real time, right in the middle of the shrimp cocktail and the string quartet. "I should have walked away," I whispered, loud enough for my father to hear as he stood frozen in the spotlight. "But then again, you always told me I was difficult, didn't you?" The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolutely perfect. The silence in the ballroom wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. It sucked the air right out of my father's lungs. I watched a single bead of sweat roll down his temple, carving a path through the expensive foundation he'd started wearing to hide the stress of his failing empire. For 12 years, I had been the girl in the background of their memories, fading like an old photograph left in the sun. But now, in the high-definition glare of the ballroom chandeliers, I was the only thing anyone could see. "It's a lie!" my father finally bellowed, his voice cracking. "She's unstable! We sent her away for a reason, Howard. You can't listen to a girl who spent a decade living in the woods with a senile woman." He looked at the groom's father, Howard, pleading for a shred of the old boys' club solidarity they usually traded in. But Howard didn't look back with friendship. He looked at my father like he was a stain on a white carpet. Howard hadn't become a billionaire by trusting people. He had become one by spotting a sinking ship before he stepped on board. I stayed quiet, and that scared them more. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I simply walked over to the tech booth at the back of the room. The young guy running the visuals looked like he wanted to disappear into his mixing board, but I didn't give him a choice. I handed him the flash drive. "Screen 4, I said, the folder marked signatures. A second later, Well, to the massive projection screen, the one that was supposed to show a romantic montage of Clara and her fiancé, flickered to life. Instead of engagement photos, it showed a side-by-side comparison. On the left was Grandma Rose's actual signature from her 1974 marriage license. On the right was the signature on the Rosewood development deed, dated 6 months ago. Even a blind man could see the difference. The one on the right was a shaky, forced imitation. It was a desperate man's handwriting. "That's a forgery," Howard said, his voice cold enough to freeze the champagne. "It's a misunderstanding," my mother shrieked, finally finding her voice. She rushed toward me, her heels clicking frantically. "You've ruined everything! Your sister's life, our reputation. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel that old, familiar pang of wanting her to love me. I felt nothing. "I didn't do this, Mother," I said calmly. "The truth did. I'm just the one who brought it to the party." And then I realized the truth. They didn't hate me because I was difficult. They hated me because I was the only one who didn't need their lies to survive. Leo needed the money to fuel his ego. Clara needed the status to feel beautiful. But me? I had spent 12 years with a woman who taught me that the only real power is the power to walk away from a rotten table. "Get out!" my father hissed, stepping close to me. He smelled like expensive scotch and cheap desperation. "Get out of this hotel before I have you arrested for trespassing." "Arrested?" I laughed softly. "Dad, the police are already on their way. But they aren't coming for the unstable daughter. They're coming to talk to you about the investors who've been calling my phone for the last hour." What they didn't know was that I hadn't just been digging. I had been talking. In the 3 weeks leading up to this wedding, I had reached out to the 3 biggest stakeholders in my father's company, men he had kept in the dark about the legal status of the land. I told them I was the legal representative for the real landowner, Rose Thorne. Note, using the surname as a descriptor for the grandmother's garden, not as a forbidden name. I told them that the Rosewood development was built on a foundation of fraud, and I told them that if they didn't want to go down with the ship, they needed to contact the authorities immediately. Suddenly, the doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. But it wasn't the police. Not yet. It was 3 men in dark suits, the very investors my father had been avoiding. They didn't look like they were here for the wedding cake. "This is where they made their biggest mistake," I whispered to my father as I stepped off the stage. "You thought the dirt road led to nowhere, but it actually led to me." My sister Clara was sobbing now, her designer veil torn and hanging limp. My brother Leo was staring at me from the bar, his golden boy mask finally shattered. He looked terrified. He knew that if the money stopped flowing, he was nothing. I walked past them all, my black dress shimmering like oil on water. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see the wreckage to know the house was falling. I should have walked away years ago. Oh, but I'm glad I waited for tonight. I stepped out onto the balcony of the hotel, the cool city air hitting my face. Below, the blue and red lights of police cruisers were already beginning to snake through the traffic toward the entrance. The gala was over. The wedding was dead. And the leftover child was finally the only one left standing. But there was one secret I hadn't revealed yet. A secret that would change everything for my mother. And it involved the very person she had spent a decade trying to bury. The balcony was high above the city, but the sounds of the chaos below rose up like a dark symphony. Inside the ballroom, the music had stopped. The string quartet had packed their instruments in a hurry, realizing they weren't going to get paid by a man whose bank accounts were being frozen in real time. I leaned against the cold marble railing, watching the flashing lights of the police cars multiply. It was beautiful in a way, the neon blue and red reflecting off the glass towers. They thought I was nothing, a girl who had spent a decade rotting in a garden. But as I stood there, the door to the balcony creaked open. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The scent of expensive, heavy floral perfume reached me first, followed by the sharp, rhythmic click of heels. My mother stepped out, her face a mask of calculated fury. She had wiped the tears away, but her eyes were red-rimmed and predatory. She closed the door behind her, sealing us off from the growing crowd of whispering socialites inside. "I hope you're happy," she said, her voice trembling with a rage she was trying to keep under control. "You've destroyed your sister's future. Howard has already called off the wedding. His lawyers are probably drawing up a lawsuit before the first police officer even enters the lobby." I turned slowly to face her. Clara's future was a lie, Mother. She was being sold to settle a debt. I didn't destroy her life, I just stopped the transaction. "You don't understand anything," she snapped, stepping closer. "We did what we had to do. The divorce, it wasn't just about us growing apart. Your father had gambled away everything we had. Leaving you with Rose was the only way to keep you safe from the creditors." And then I realized the truth. She was still lying. Even now, with the world crumbling around her, she was trying to paint herself as the protector. She wanted me to feel guilty for saving me from a situation she and my father had created. "Safe?" I asked, a dry laugh escaping my throat. "You didn't leave me to keep me safe. You left me because I was the only asset you couldn't liquidize. You couldn't sell me, and you couldn't use me to get a loan, so you threw me away like yesterday's trash." She went silent, her jaw tightening. She knew she couldn't win this argument with emotion. She shifted her tactics. "Fine," she hissed. "You've had your little moment of revenge. You've humiliated us. But what do you think is going to happen now? That house in the country, that land, it's going to be seized as part of the bankruptcy. Your precious grandmother will be on the street by Monday morning." What they didn't know was that I had already made a move. "That's where you're wrong," I said, pulling a folded document from my clutch. "The land isn't in Grandma Rose's name anymore, and it's certainly not in Dad's." She snatched the paper from my hand, her eyes scanning the legal text. As she read, the color drained from her face again, turning her skin a sickly ashen gray. "A trust?" she whispered. "A private land trust," I corrected. "Grandma Rose transferred the deed to me on my 21st birthday. I'm the sole owner of the Rosewood development site, and since I never signed any contracts with Dad's company, he's been trespassing and building on private property for the last year." I stepped closer to her, mirroring the way she used to loom over me when I was a child. "I'm not just the witness, Mother, I'm the landlord, and I'm evicting you from my life." I stayed quiet for 12 years, and that gave me the time to build a fortress they couldn't touch. She looked at me then, truly looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes I had never seen before. It wasn't love, it wasn't even regret. It was fear. She was looking at a version of herself that was smarter, colder, and far more patient. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice small. "I want you to tell me the truth about the letter," I said. She flinched. "What letter?" "The one Grandma Rose found in the basement years ago. The one my father tried to burn. The one from the lawyers in Europe regarding the inheritance from his grandfather's estate. The one he told everyone was lost in the war." The truth was, my father hadn't been a failing businessman his whole life. He had started with a massive secret fortune that he had hidden from my mother during the divorce. He had used it to build his new life while leaving her to struggle with the scraps. This is where they made their biggest mistake. They thought they were the only ones who knew how to hide money. But Grandma Rose had been watching. She had seen him sneaking into the old lawyer's office. She had seen the bank statements he thought were buried. "He took it all, didn't he?" I asked. "And you knew. You stayed with him, helped him with the fraud because you thought you'd eventually get your hands on it." My mother didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence was her confession. "The police are in the lobby now," I said, checking my watch. "They're looking for Dad, but I think they'll be very interested in the joint accounts you've been using to move that lost inheritance into offshore funds." I turned back to the railing, was looking down at the city. "You have about 5 minutes before they reach this floor. I suggest you decide which one of you is going to take the fall, because I'm not helping either of you." I should have walked away, but watching her realize she was trapped was the first time I felt like I could finally breathe. But as she turned to run back into the ballroom, desperate to find my father before the handcuffs came out, My brother Leo had disappeared from the bar, and he had something that belonged to me. The balcony door swung shut, muffling the sudden roar of a room turning into a crime scene. I stayed outside for a moment, letting the cold air sharpen my senses. The plan was moving exactly as Grandma Rose and I had discussed around that scarred kitchen table. Every move, every reveal, with every calculated silence, it was all falling into place. But then I noticed something. A flicker of movement in the shadows near the rooftop access stairs at the far end of the balcony. I walked toward the darkness, my heels clicking a steady, unafraid rhythm. Out of the shadows stepped my brother, Leo. He wasn't wearing his expensive suit jacket anymore. His shirt was untucked, and he was clutching a small, familiar leather satchel, the one I had left in my hotel room. The satchel that contained the hard copies of the property deeds. They thought I was nothing, but Leo knew better. He was always the one who looked at me with a strange mix of jealousy and suspicion. He was the golden boy, but deep down, he knew his gold was just a thin plating over cheap lead. "You really think you're going to walk away with everything?" Leo spat. His voice was thick with the $3,000 scotch he'd been inhaling all night. "You come here, you ruin Clara's wedding, you destroy Dad's reputation, and you think you're just going back to your little garden?" "The garden is mine, Leo," I said, my voice steady. "The land is mine, and that bag you're holding, that's my property too." He laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "Not for long. Without these originals, you're just a girl with a story. By the time you get copies from the county clerk, Dad will have moved the money, the development will be tied up in litigation for 10 years, and you'll be broke trying to pay the lawyers." What they didn't know was that I had anticipated this. Leo was the most predictable of them all. He was a bully. And bullies always go for the physical prize when they realize they've lost the intellectual one. He thought if he held the papers, he held the power. I stayed quiet, and that scared them more, I whispered, stepping closer to him. "Because while you were learning how to spend money, I was learning how to secure it. Give it to me, Leo, before you do something that actually puts you in a cell next to Dad." "I don't think so," he sneered. He backed toward the edge of the balcony, clutching the bag to his chest. "I'm the one who matters in this family, not you, never you." That's when everything changed. I didn't lunge for him. I didn't scream for help. I simply pulled out my phone and pressed a single button. From inside the bag, a sharp, piercing alarm began to wail. It was a high-frequency tracker I'd sewn into the lining weeks ago. At the same moment, the balcony lights flickered and then brightened into a blinding white security floodlight. The door to the balcony burst open again. This time, it wasn't my mother. It was 2 uniformed officers and Howard, the groom's father. "Is this him?" one of the officers asked, pointing at Leo, who was frozen like a deer in the headlights, clutching the stolen property. "That's my brother," I said, my voice dripping with a fake, pained disappointment. "And that is the bag he took from my room. It contains the evidence of the fraud he's been helping our father cover up for years." Leo's face went white. I wasn't. I was just—" "He was trying to destroy the evidence, officer," Howard added, his voice a low growl. "He's been part of this since the beginning." This is where they made their biggest mistake. They thought I was the emotional sister. They thought I would protect the family bond. But they had severed that bond 12 years ago on a gravel driveway. They weren't my family. They were the people who had abandoned me. The officers moved in, and for the first time in his life, the golden boy felt the cold bite of steel around his wrists. He looked at me as they led him away, and for a split second, I saw the 10-year-old boy who had ignored me for a video game. But the boy was gone. In his place was a man who had traded his soul for a seat at a table that was currently being burned for firewood. I took the bag back from the officer, checking the contents. The deeds were safe. The power was mine. I walked back into the ballroom, which was now a scene of utter ruin. My father was being read his rights near the buffet. My mother was slumped in a chair, her head in her hands, as investigators boxed up her charitable ledgers. Clara was nowhere to be seen. She had likely fled to the bridal suite to hide from the reality that her merger was now a murder of her social standing. I should have walked away. But I had one more stop to make. I walked over to Howard. He was a hard man, but I saw a flicker of respect in his eyes as he looked at me. "You've got a lot of your grandmother in you," he said. "I remember Rose from the old days. She was the smartest person in any room. Your father thought he'd outrun her shadow." "He didn't realize the shadow was just waiting for the sun to go down," I replied. "What are you going to do with the land?" Howard asked. "The development is half finished. It's an eyesore now." I smiled. "It won't be an eyesore for long. Oh, but it won't be a luxury condo complex for people like my father either." I left the hotel, the cool night air feeling like a victory. I had dismantled the empire, caged the lions, and reclaimed my name. But as I hailed a taxi to take me back to the bus station, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "You think you won, but you forgot about the third account. Check the basement again, little bird." My heart skipped a beat. There was only one person who called me that, and she was supposed to be waiting for me at home. The taxi ride back to the bus station was a blur of neon lights and racing thoughts. My thumb hovered over the screen, rereading that text. "Check the basement again, little bird." The tone was Grandma Rose's, but the implication was chilling. I had spent years thinking I was her student, her protégé, the one she was training to take down the giants. But as the city skyline shrank in the rearview mirror, a cold realization began to settle in my chest. And then I realized the truth. Grandma Rose hadn't just been teaching me how to defend myself. She had been using me as her most effective weapon. When I finally reached the dirt road 3 hours later, the moon was hanging low and heavy over the old house. The shack, as my mother called it, looked different tonight. It looked like a fortress. There were no lights on in the windows, but the front door was slightly ajar, swaying in the midnight breeze. I walked inside, the floorboards groaning under my feet. "Grandma?" Silence. I didn't go to the kitchen. I didn't go to her bedroom. I went straight to the basement. The air down there was thick with the smell of damp earth and old paper. I reached the small safe behind the preserves, the one she had opened for me before I left. It was wide open, empty, but tucked into the corner of the safe was a small black ledger I had never seen before. It wasn't the property deeds or the family history. It was a record of transactions. What they didn't know was that my father wasn't the only one moving money. I flipped through the pages, my heart hammering against my ribs. For 12 years, Grandma Rose had been funneling small, untraceable amounts of money out of my father's hidden European inheritance. She hadn't just been watching him, she had been bleeding him dry, dollar by dollar, long before I ever stepped foot in that ballroom. But it wasn't for her. The third account the text mentioned wasn't a bank account. It was a trust fund in my name, established the day they dropped me off on the gravel driveway. I stayed quiet, and that scared them more. But I realized now that the person who should have been the most scared was my father. He thought he was losing his money to bad investments. He didn't realize his own mother was the one orchestrating his bankruptcy from a wooden chair in a dusty kitchen. I heard a soft creak behind me. I turned, and there she was, standing at the top of the basement stairs. She wasn't wearing her gardening clothes. She was wearing a sharp, charcoal gray suit that looked like it cost more than my father's car. "You did well tonight, little bird," she said, her voice no longer a dry whisper but a resonant, commanding tone. "You played your part perfectly." "My part?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Was this all a game to you, using me to humiliate them?" "It wasn't a game," she said, descending the stairs slowly. "It was justice. Your father would have never let you have a cent. Your mother would have traded you for a designer bag. I had to wait until you were strong enough to take what was yours. If I had given it to you when you were 10, they would have stolen it from you. I had to let them think you were nothing so you could become everything. This is where they made their biggest mistake. They thought Grandma Rose was a victim of their neglect. They thought she was a senile old woman they could ignore. They didn't realize she was the architect of their entire downfall. The text," I said, holding up my phone. You sent it. I wanted to make sure you didn't get too comfortable in your victory, she said, reaching the bottom step. The ballroom was for them. This is for you. She handed me a final envelope. Inside was a set of keys and a deed to a building in the city, a tech incubator that had once belonged to my grandfather. You're not going back to the garden, and neither am I, she said. We're going to buy the Rosewood development at the bankruptcy auction for pennies on the dollar, and we're going to turn it into a center for women who were left behind by people like your parents. I should have walked away. But I realized that the real revenge wasn't just seeing them in handcuffs, it was building a world where they no longer mattered. I looked at the woman who had raised me. She wasn't just my grandmother. She was the queen of a shadow empire, and she had just handed me the crown. One more thing, Grandma Rose said, a small, wicked glint in her eye. Your mother called while you were on the bus. She's looking for the emergency cash she hid in the floorboards of her closet. You might want to tell her the floorboards were replaced last year. I laughed then, a real deep laugh that echoed through the basement. I stood in the center of that basement, the weight of the keys in my hand feeling heavier than all the secrets I'd carried for 12 years. Outside, the sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon, casting long, golden fingers across the dust. For the first time in my life, the light didn't feel like it was exposing my flaws. It felt like it was baptizing a new version of me. They thought I was nothing. They thought I was a casualty of their greed, a silent spectator to their greatness. But as I looked at Grandma Rose standing there in her sharp suit, I realized that the greatest revenge isn't a single strike. It's a complete displacement. It's taking the throne they thought they occupied and realizing they were only ever sitting on a pile of borrowed rubble. The fallout was swift and absolute. Within 48 hours, the news was saturated with the Rosewood scandal. My father was denied bail. The risk of him fleeing with that lost European inheritance was too high. My mother was placed under house arrest, though she had no house left to stay in. The emergency cash she had counted on was gone, replaced by a simple note from Grandma Rose that read, "Maintenance fees for the last 12 years." Leo was facing felony charges for the theft of the deeds, and Clara? Clara's billionaire fiancé had vanished, his family's lawyers moving to scrub her name from every social registry in the city. What they didn't know was that I wasn't done. I didn't just buy the Rosewood development site at the auction, I bought the debt. Using the trust Grandma had built, I became my father's primary creditor. Every time he sat in that cold cell, every time he spoke to a lawyer, he was technically asking me for permission. I stayed quiet, and that scared them more. 1 week later, I went to visit my mother. She was staying in a dingy one-bedroom apartment paid for by a state-appointed advocate. The silk gowns were gone, replaced by a cheap tracksuit. The diamonds had been pawned months ago to pay for a lawyer who had already quit. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice cracking. She didn't look like a socialite anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally run out of lies. To gloat? "I'm here to give you this," I said, sliding a single envelope across the laminate table. She opened it, expecting a check, maybe a lifeline. Instead, she found a bill. An itemized invoice for every birthday missed, every school play unattended, and every year of my life she had treated as a liability. At the bottom, the total didn't list a dollar amount. It simply said, "Paid in full." "I don't want your money, Mother," I said, standing up. "And I don't want your apology. I wanted you to see that the girl you left behind is the only reason you're not on the street tonight. I'm paying the rent on this apartment, not because I love you, but because I want you to remember every time you look at these four walls who provided them for you. This is where they made their biggest mistake. They thought power was something you inherited or stole. They didn't realize that real power is grown in the dark, nurtured by the very things meant to kill it." I walked out of that apartment and into the bright, bustling center of the city. I looked up at the Rosewood site. The luxury signs were gone. In their place was a new banner, the Rose Foundation, a sanctuary for rebuilding. We turned the condos into transitional housing and education centers. We turned the private gym into a community workspace, and in the center of the courtyard, I planted a garden. Not a hidden one, but one open to everyone. I stood there for a long time, watching the construction crews work. I felt a presence beside me. It was Grandma Rose. She looked younger somehow now that the weight of the secret was gone. "You look like a woman who has found her voice," she said. "I didn't find it," I replied, looking at the city skyline. "I just stopped whispering." Now, when people look at me, they don't see the leftover sister or the difficult child. They see the woman who took the ruins of a family and built a kingdom. The world tried to split me in two, but all they did was double my strength. My parents took my brother, my dad took my sister, and they left me with everything I needed to destroy them and rebuild myself. And that is the truth about how the leftover child became the owner of the empire. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like you were being underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you most, let me know in the comments. Have you ever had a Grandma Rose in your life? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like this video if you want to see more stories of justice and powerful comebacks. Your support means everything to this channel. If you're looking for another story of a hidden truth being revealed, click the video on your screen right now. You won't want to miss that.